Brought to you by Connect.js, Atlanta's premier JavaScript conference. Sponsored in part by FeatherDirect. Need a mobile app? Contact us for your custom mobile solution.
Grab some of that stuff. I guess at the end of the talk, that would be great. All right, let's get started. Yeah. It's 1 o'clock.
Let's do it.
This is Make It Work. I'm Brandy. This is Kristin, and we both work at Big Nerd Ranch. Make It Work is going to be talking about designers and developers working together in harmony. If you're not interested in designers and developers working together in harmony, there's another panel down the road. But hopefully you are very interested in that. How many developers do we have in the room? Raise your hand. Just about what I figured. Are there any designers in the room? Yes, look at this showing. All right, how many of you are unicorns? Who does both? We have a couple unicorns. Oh, a lot of them. Nice, very cool. Good deal. Well, if you are going to learn how to work with yourself here in this session, it's going to be great. Let's talk about Big Nerd Ranch for a second. We teach intensive boot camps that are about a week long on several different topics, mostly about building apps. We teach a JavaScript course, Ruby on the server, iOS and Android courses, and design courses for those platforms. We teach them in the middle of the woods, and we teach them at your office. So we'll come to you and bring that class to you if you need it. We also build apps for clients, and that's where a lot of today's session learnings have come from. So we'll be talking about all of that. But we build the apps on those platforms that I mentioned as well. We also write books on how to program. That might be actually where you know us from. And so, again, along those same lines. Kristin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Kristin Marscicano, and first of all, I'm not mic'd, so can you all hear me okay? That's in the back row? Okay, awesome. So I'm an Android developer and instructor at Big Nerd Ranch, and so what that means is I spend a majority of my time at the ranch in our office or somewhere in Atlanta developing Android apps. So I'm getting to do hands-on work, and then about 25% of the time I'm on the road, traveling all over the world, teaching our week-long Android boot camp. Right now I'm actually on hiatus from that because I'm co-writing our Introduction to Java class, so if that's something you're interested, please keep a lookout for it. It's supposed to come out in 2015. I'm really excited. And prior to working at Big Nerd Ranch, I really missed being part of a team, and I missed, being hands-on and creating. And so I'm really excited to be at Big Nerd Ranch doing those things. And before I let Brandy talk about herself, I have a confession to make. Brandy asked me to do this with her, and my first reaction was, no way. I was terrified, number one, because I'm not a web developer, obviously. And number two, because I've never really had hard times working with designers. So far, everything has been pretty smooth working with them. But I really respect Brandy, and I figured that since she thought this was important and it was something she wanted to talk about, that I probably had something to learn. And I definitely did learn a lot. So I learned a lot about why things do work at Big Nerd Ranch, and that's part of the reason why I hadn't had bad experiences, is because I've really only worked with designers while I've been at Big Nerd Ranch. And I'm excited to share what I learned with you today.
I'm Brandy Porter, and I'm the Director of Design at Big Nerd Ranch. And it's true, Kristin tried to finagle out of doing this with me very politely, but I was able to coerce her instead to come with me. I knew that Kristin had a very different background than I did, and so I wanted her to bring that fold into the story. My background is actually in advertising. That's where I started out. In advertising, the art director was master of the universe. We brought in the developer once we sold all of our fantastic ideas to the client. You can imagine what developers thought about us at that time. After advertising, I went to webmd.com. When I started there, it was very waterfall. The design team would put together a PSD, they would throw it up on the server. The developers, who were literally over the wall, would grab the file. We didn't know which developer was going to get the file. And they would build the page, and then they would toss it back over the wall. Not literally, on the server. And the designer could then QA the build and then mark up the build with Photoshop and then send it back over. And then it was a really inefficient process. But by the time that I left WebMD, we had begun to introduce an agile workflow into our process. And so I actually had a dev partner that I sat next to, and we iterated on a lot of new products together. It was a really fantastic, rewarding relationship. And at Big Nerd Ranch, as Kristin mentioned, we really don't see a ton of conflict between designers and developers. Nobody's perfect, but for the most part, it's very smooth. And I was very curious to find out why that is and what's different about other relationships and other environments. And I wanted to kind of bring what we learned to other people, spread the good news, to see if we could, give some tips and tricks that would help some other people in the same situations. Why are we here? As I just mentioned, there are sometimes frictional relationships between designers and developers. Lack of communication, lack of collaboration, just friction. And so we knew that designers and developers often spoke a very different language, but we wanted to figure out why. And we wanted to help that language become a little more unified. And so we interviewed a lot of people. And what we figured out is that there are a lot of stereotypes about designers and developers. I have a feeling that you know several of them. But we wanted to kind of explore those stereotypes and have a little fun in doing it. So we're going to do a little skit comedy. I'm going to be the designer.
I'm going to be the developer/nerd.
My beret's at the dry cleaner. Oh my God, this is the first build that I got from the developer. This doesn't actually look like my design. I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to QA here. The background's the right color. At least they got that part right. Where's my grid? Why is this photo all the way aligned right? This isn't even in any kind of a style order. I'm not even sure what's happening with that yellow, but I guess I'm just gonna kind of resubmit my design to them and let them know that they need to fix everything.
Oh my gosh, you're not going to believe the email I just got from the designer who finally decided to take a look at the build I sent them. She nitpicked the tiniest things. Oh, there's a pixel of padding missing on the right side. Oh my gosh, the yellow, it's not the right shade, it's 1 or 2 off. Seriously, I am paid to make this thing work, right? I can't be wasting my time tweaking pixels of padding here and there.
Developer, I have this amazing idea. I've already sold it to the client. They love it. So I've animated something in After Effects for you so that you understand the movement that I'm looking for. All right, it's going to go, let me play it for you. When the page scrolls down, I want all of these particles to kind of build and make something. Whoop. All right, also in addition to making something, I want there to be this right-hand navigation that runs in line with all of that build. So it has to sync up. Then, as the page scrolls even more, I want this camera to build out of these parts. And I want all of that parallax scrolling to happen, so if you scrub up and down, the camera builds in a perfect order. I also am going to need for this to work in IE8. So if you could maybe throw in some graceful degradation, that would be amazing. What do you think?
No way. I cannot believe that you went and brought this to the client without getting me to agree on it first. There's no way I can make this work.
Developers just automatically say no about everything. Don't they understand the value that this brings to this campaign?
Wow, this design looks pretty awesome, but I have no idea how to get all of those parts to move in sync like that and smoothly. In IE8, is she kidding me? Oh man, I could try to make this work. I'd love to learn how, but I know exactly what's going to happen. Same old story. It's going to go way over budget, way over time, and the client's going to be really upset. Much better for us to just keep it simple and actually make it happen. Oh my. This is the comp I just got from the designer for the site I'm supposed to create. How am I supposed to work with this? It's so incomplete. It's completely static, first of all. There's no information about hover states. How is this supposed to be responsive? What's it supposed to look like on a widescreen versus on a phone? And what about things like the cart? What's it supposed to look like when the cart is empty? What about when I click one of those fancy little delete icons? Does it just refresh the whole page? Is there supposed to be an animated transition? I'm so sick of getting missing information and being expected to just fill in the blocks. That's not my job. I need to know what it's supposed to look like so I can actually make it work.
What does the developer expect me to do? I got the tiniest budget to put this page together. It's a cart. Every website in the world has a cart. They need to roll with it. It's obviously a grid. It's just going to stack over each other, just like every other responsive site out there. That top menu, hamburger button, come on. I need for the developer to use their brain and to think through the very obvious things that are happening here. I don't have the time or the budget for this.
oh crap. The final product is out there and the client is so upset, everybody hates it. The scrolling isn't smooth, users think it's confusing. This is totally that designer's fault. I told her this would happen, she should have kept it simple and understood that if I want to make this work cross-browser and make it usable, it's got to be simple. It's all her fault.
Oh my God, the site is launched, everybody hates it. It's janky, it doesn't scroll smoothly, and it crashes all the time. The developer clearly didn't know what they were doing. It's clearly the developer's fault. Sound a little familiar to anyone? Just a little side note, none of those designs are ours. We totally ripped on other people's designs. But, and all of the designs are beautiful. But down at the ranch, we don't really see these problems, these conflicts of, stereotypical reactions to things. We definitely, have a little bit here and there. Like I said, no one's perfect, but let me get the scarf off. Hold on. I am like double mic'd. Oh, I lost my little foam thing. That's what happens when they give me the mics. Anyways, the environment at the ranch is much more collaborative, and it's much more open, and it's much more efficient as a result.
So in getting ready for this talk, as Brandy had mentioned before, we spent a lot of time talking to developers and designers both at Big Nerd Ranch and people outside of Big Nerd Ranch to hear about their experiences. And we heard a lot of stories and a lot of stereotypes, and we saw a lot of recurring themes. And one thing we started to realize is that in a lot of the positive interactions, the individuals in those interactions exhibited a set of common traits. Those are communication, respect, ownership, and craftsmanship. And so while they seem a little bit fuzzy and they seem to overlap a little bit, well, that's because they actually do. And so what we wanted to do is to first of all give you some concrete recommendations that perhaps will hopefully apply to some of you in some of your situations. But these are things that you as an individual can do to try to help your collaboration with your counterpart, be it a designer or developer.
So the first dimension is communication. That seems pretty straightforward. You talk to each other. However, there are little nuanced behaviors that you can add to your communication that can open up doors and make things much easier for you. The first one we offer is to ask questions. Sometimes there's a little bit of a fear of appearing unsure. You kick off a project, you're given something completely overwhelming that's been sold to the client. You really want to ask some questions that can set some foundational rules in your mind, but instead maybe you hunker down and think, I'm going to figure this out on my own. It'll probably take me a few more hours tonight, but I'll get it done. And then everyone will think I'm the hero. And that kind of promotes this fake it till you make it mentality, and sometimes that totally works. But sometimes it doesn't, and you end up late for a deadline or disappointing a client or something like that. So by asking questions early on, you can mitigate a lot of that unknown issue later on. Meet face to face. At the Big Nerd Ranch, we're fortunate enough to literally sit in the same building with very low walls as most of our designers and developers. Some of us are remote, but we just use Google Hangouts to call in and have a video talk. By meeting face to face, we are reiterating that we're both human and that we have feelings. And also, we are being able to see in real time any assumptions that we might have about the project. We can read body language to figure out if this person's being sarcastic or if they're being a little bit nervous or frustrated about something. And so that just opens up that communication and makes it a little more efficient. Talk often. By creating multiple smaller instances of talking throughout your project, you're going to be able to tackle issues, smaller issues, much more quickly. At the ranch, we use daily stand-ups on projects to meet as a team, and it reinforces that we are a team on this project. And we also use chat rooms like Campfire. We have those open while we're working on a project, and then if a developer needs to ask the designer a question, they can simply chat to that designer. By talking often, we can shorten that feedback loop so that we have a more stable product as we move along. We don't reach a point where someone has been in a cave working on something and then all of a sudden reveals a product that's not right.
So the next big thing to think about as an individual is respect. Part of this, when it comes to collaborating with your counterpart, is to be an approachable expert. A lot of this is to make your counterpart feel comfortable asking questions, right? It's especially hard, I know for me at least, when I get busy and I'm stressed out and I'm really trying to finish something. when someone comes to me, to be open and to act like I really care about, answering their question for them. But the key is you don't want to make them feel stupid, and you don't want to make them feel like you're wasting their time, otherwise you're going to close them off from actually asking the question. Another part of this is to develop appreciation. And part of this, it's appreciating the other person's strengths and skills. Part of this is to understand what you don't know, right? I don't really know much about design at all, and so it's very easy for me to assume, oh, it must just be easy, or it's some sort of magic, and it doesn't take them very long. But growing appreciation for the fact that your counterpart has spent probably as much, if not more time as you, developing their own craft and their own skills, and appreciating the fact that they're strengthening you guys as a team. The other thing is to empathize with your partner. So this goes, if you're a designer, empathizing with the developer and vice versa. And part of this is to understand what sorts of constraints they're operating under. So maybe it's something about user needs, maybe it's client pressure, maybe it's platform constraints. But understanding what sort of pressures they're under, and also understanding what are their priorities in the project, right? As a developer, I'm always worried about, of course, my code being beautiful and readable and all of that fun stuff. But I also really care about performance and stability, whereas a designer might be more interested and have higher priority on what it looks like and the user experience. So understanding where they're coming from in that respect can help you communicate better. And then finally, this can be super tough, especially if someone doesn't treat you very well in one particular case, but is to remember that your collaborators are people too. And so I'm not recommending that you let someone walk all over you, but just understanding that they're under their own set of pressures and they have their own things going on. If there's some sort of negative interaction, rather than jumping into the stereotypical response, taking a minute to step back and giving them the benefit of the doubt. And hopefully using it as an opportunity to discuss what went on and to find ways to make it better for the next time.
I try to remember this when I'm driving in Atlanta traffic.
Yeah.
Perhaps the other person has had a bad day.
It's a good way to practice, for sure.
The next dimension is ownership. Owning your project and being a member of the team is a really important component to project success. The first tenet here is to speak up. Use your voice. Didn't quite get what you were supposed to get from the designer. Maybe they didn't know they were supposed to provide that to you. Go ahead and speak up and ask for that. Do you see a process that's a little bit concerning? Go ahead and speak up about that. You own this project just as much as your partners do. Be dependable. Become a trustworthy team member. If you make a promise, keep that promise to your team. But also, if you're not able to make a deadline for some reason, go ahead and communicate that. Bring it up as early as you know that it's not going to happen. By being a reliable source of information, your team is going to learn to depend on you. Be a part of the solution, not the problem. Be the change you want to see in the world. By focusing on ways to improve your situation rather than voicing a complaint about a problem and expecting someone else to take care of it, you're actually becoming a part of the change, and you're improving your relationship with your teammates in addition to the process that you're working with. Favor project success over job description. I know it can be very tempting to kind of draw your box and figure out where your job description lies, and everything that is outside of your job description is someone else's responsibility. But sometimes on a team, that other person doesn't exist on the team. And so feel free to reach out and grab those duties that are kind of laying by the wayside and pick them up and run with them and become an advocate for the project's success rather than just the person who does these things under this job description.
And the final trait that we want to talk about is craftsmanship. So this is all about taking pride in the final product. It's not just about the little piece you contributed, but the whole final result, and also about how you ended up with that result. So taking pride in the process and in the collaboration and being a better collaborator. Also important is to practice quality assurance. So obviously the typical quality assurance from the software functionality standpoint, but also quality assurance in the design. So the implementation of the design, does what you actually created look like the designer's vision? And quality assurance of the design itself. So does the design meet the requirements of the app or the site or whatever you're building? And with all of this quality assurance and feedback comes the importance of being open and encouraging constructive criticism. Again, when timelines are tight, when people start thinking about, oh, it's my job to make this thing work and be stable, and it's my job to make it look great, right? It's very hard to get feedback. I don't know about you all, but sometimes, no matter how hard I try, I attach my ego to the thing that I've created. And so it can be really hard for someone to say, this part is really slow, or, the crash rate is 75%. Just kidding, I never build software like that. So just remembering to be open to constructive criticism. And a lot of times, my way of trying to do this is to just ask for it. Even though I feel like I don't want it, I feel like at least if I've asked for it, I'm empowered in wanting the constructive criticism back. And then finally, with craftsmanship, is to educate yourself. So obviously, educate yourself within your own profession. Coming to conferences is a great start. Learning new skills, new tools, and new approaches, but also educating yourself and your counterparts' professions. So I'm not saying become a designer or a developer, but if you can learn a little bit about what goes into that job and what sorts of skills that person has, it gives you, as we talked about before, a greater appreciation for the work that they're doing. And sometimes it can help you be a better teammate in terms of giving better constructive criticism back, because you actually know a little bit about their profession.
Yeah, at Big Nerd Ranch, our designers go to the iOS programming class or the JavaScript programming class, and they learn just enough to get into trouble with those platforms. But what it does is it creates an understanding of what that platform is capable of, so they can have more enriching conversations with their developer partners. Also, several of them are unicorns, and so they enjoy pushing their skills in that way.
Yeah, and one of the big things about educate yourself too is obviously knowing your platform, right? Knowing the constraints, knowing the common usage paradigms. And what is awesome about the designers at Big Nerd Ranch is they're really interested in knowing that. And so it's really great to see the partnership between the designers and the developers teaching what they know about usability on their platform and the constraints that they're operating under, and vice versa. So we gave you some specific things along each of these dimensions, and hopefully you can apply some, if not all of those. But even if you can't, I think that thinking about communication, respect, ownership, and craftsmanship is still very useful. I think it's a great way to, it's a great lens through which to look at different situations. So if you have, for instance, a bad situation, it's very easily to get emotionally charged. And so if you can use this as a framework for evaluating what's going on, trying to say, okay, is there something that I could have done differently across each of these? Or is there something someone else on the team could be doing differently? It gives you a framework for talking about it rather than just, blowing up and crying or running away or whatever you might do.
So we talked a lot about individual traits that you can personally look at when you're working with other individuals, but sometimes that problem is bigger than you are. Sometimes it's more systemic, and so we also brought in some parts and pieces of our process at Big Nerd Ranch to share with you so that hopefully you can apply some of these tips and tricks to your process and improve it along the same guidelines.
So the first one is to work iteratively. So iterative development has been widely accepted for a long time, but the same is not necessarily true for design. A lot of times you get in a situation where the expectation is that the design is completely done up front, and then it's given to the development team who then goes and iterates and creates it, right? But the flaw with that is that as the site or the app is created, it evolves. The scope evolves, the client learns more about what they actually want, and if you don't have a way for design to come along and to change their part of it as they go, it can cause some problems. So what we've been trying out is including the designers in the project from start to finish, and they operate in sprints just like the developers do. But the key here is it's not just like willy-nilly and everyone's just trying to figure out what's going on, but the designers lead the charge. And so they're one sprint ahead of the developers, meaning they're designing the work that the developers are implementing in the next sprint. What's really nice about this is it encourages iterative feedback. So the designers are getting feedback on little chunks of their design all along the way, rather than designing the whole thing, getting feedback, and having a lot more overhead in changing it. And also, the developers are getting feedback from the designers. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to encourage the design quality assurance. And what that means, I've kind of referenced it before, but it's number one, making sure the implementation matches the design, right? So at the end of each sprint, the designers are reviewing the build and figuring out if there's any big red flags. But also, we're making sure that the design is meeting our requirements and that it makes sense in the context of everything else we're doing. In order to make this work, you really need to build it into the process. You have to allocate time for it. It takes time, and so it's basically going to take time away from actual development. And the key here is to agree on process. That means getting the client on board, educating them on what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it this way, because it is different than what a lot of people are used to. Making sure everybody on the team is on board, so educating the designers and the developers about what you're trying to do. And I think also understanding that you may have to tweak it along the way, right? The process will evolve to fit your situation. So as we got designers and developers working together so closely for extended periods of time, we started to realize there was a problem in coordinating the work, right? There wasn't good visibility to the client about what designers versus developers were doing, and also there wasn't good visibility within the team about dependencies. So as developers at Big Nerd Ranch, for a long time we've been using user stories to track our work. If you're not familiar with it, a user story is just a way of expressing a chunk of work from the user's perspective. So something like, the user can change their password, or the user can create a new profile. And all of the development work is driven from that, even to the point where the client finally accepts that chunk of work. And we use a system called Pivotal Tracker to keep track of all of this. There's other ones like Trello. But the key is, number one, put it in Pivotal Tracker. And so we gave the designers their own Pivotal Tracker projects. So we had a separate project for developers and a separate for designers. And that wasn't really so great, just because there was no way to coordinate, and there was no real reason for developers to look at the designers and vice versa. And it was more things for the client to keep track of. So instead, we started putting them all in the same Pivotal Tracker project. So the point here is to keep the design and the development stories in the same place. But then the problem comes, how do you organize them? And so in Pivotal Tracker, we use something called an epic. And so we group all of the stories for one feature into one huge epic. So an epic would be something like, user can create a profile. And in there, the design stories might be things like create the wireframes for the flow, create the styling for the screens. And the stories for the developer may even be as granular as, although this isn't maybe from the user perspective as much, but the information gets validated. So the user sees feedback if their information is incorrect for some reason. And so now that you've grouped them all, you know that they all track towards the same feature. But the key is to highlight the dependencies. Pivotal Tracker isn't the best about this. We do things like the way we order the stories are used to show dependency. You can link between stories, and you can use tags. But it's also important to just continue to communicate outside the tool, right? Especially when you've got so many different moving parts. Now that you've got the designers iterating with the developers, the design is continually moving, and so it's really key to continue to communicate. And we've been trying out having the designers and the developers, even developers across different platforms, all sitting together if they're working on the same project. And that's been really nice to foster communication.
We can also address style inconsistencies. Sometimes if you have a very large site, or you have multiple designers or multiple developers on a project, there can be inconsistent styling resulting from that, and it can create a real headache for someone down the road. Not only is it a beast on maintenance, but even building that takes a lot more effort than it should. So use building blocks or modules. Jason Reese had a great talk earlier about burrito components. Yes? Hopefully you caught that. But by using uniform building blocks from a design perspective and from a development perspective, you can create a system of content types that you can then reuse over and over again. We got a project once at Big Nerd Ranch, and it was client files that came in from a site that several developers had worked on. It was our job to clean them up and add on some additional pages to the app. And so we looked through the file, and there were 7 different instances of the same shade of blue. I'm a huge advocate for varying shades of color, but this was a little ridiculous. It was just where someone had used an eyedropper to pick the color instead of actually referring to a style guide and finding the right color. So we had to, find and switch out all of those colors of blue to make it more uniform moving forward. It was the same with headlines and subheads and buttons and things like that. So by using this uniform system, you can create something that's easy to build now and that is more sustainable as you move on down. And you can hold all of those principles in a living style guide. A living style guide is basically, for us, a website that goes right along with the web app that we're building, and it actually has the different content types built on that page. And if something changes, you can go in and change that page. Everybody has the same URL. They're using the same live, up-to-date information every time they have to build something new or change something. There are no PDFs that have dates on them that are out of date floating around. No versioning happening here. It's a beautiful thing. Let me show you what the Big Nerd Ranch style guide looks like.
What the hell?
I told you to remind me to connect to the internet.
Oh, that's my fault.
I'm going to show it to you afterwards. But I can go ahead and show you the Big Nerd Ranch page. I wonder if I can hit back. No, okay. This is luckily still loaded. So the Big Nerd Ranch web page, and it's bleeding off the edge here, but you can see the main header stays consistent throughout this site. But as you move down, there are header types. There is body copy. There's a bullet style. As we move on down, there's a separate section that has a bit of a different color treatment. There are even link treatments here and form treatments. All of this is standard, it's consistent. We simply pull it from our live style guide, which I'll show you in a second. The great thing about that living style guide is that you can get the code right from the page. You just simply click the link that says get the code, and you can grab the original code straight from the living style guide, so you're not rewriting anything either. It's beautiful. We'll show you that in a little bit, but if you have any questions about that, we can elaborate. Along with that, reiterates a common design language for style names and base elements. Because we're using a living style guide, everything has a name right there in the style guide, and so we refer back to that if we hand over new designs. We don't use a different word for the secondary button. We don't say the yellow button. We always use the same lingo, and that way the developer can also use the same lingo. We collaborate at the beginning of a project to figure out what we're going to name things, and that way, 3 months down the road, if somebody else gets on the project and they have to make changes, they can pick up where we left off. Interaction designers have a lot of new responsibility with a lot of new capabilities in the browser now. It's no longer okay to just hand over a PSD that doesn't move. It's more important to convey motion in your designs, whether there's easing, whether there's an animation when you add something to the cart. If a little kitten carries something into the cart, you have to discuss this with your developer. And so collaborate early on. Sit down as a designer and a developer partnership and discuss your vision for that animation, because it's going to take some time in your budget to add that stuff. But if you sit down early on and discuss your expectations, you can collaborate on the most efficient way to incorporate these really fun animations, or these animations that help a user along. Utilize dynamic mockup tools if you're not able to sit there and code it yourself. Apps like Webflow and Marvel do a great job of adding basic animations and transitions into static mockups. So you can bring your JPEG mockups into these apps, add hotspots, and then make the pages or screens move in the ways that are native. But there are also a lot of great new tools that are coming out that allow you to add more custom animation. Don't go into After Effects unless you really know the capabilities of what you're building there versus what is capable in the browser. Who else gotten an After Effects video that was just ridiculous? A couple people. So in addition to these other ways of communicating, schedule pairing sessions. At Big Nerd Ranch, as we mentioned, we sit in the same room with each other. And so the designer can go and sit next to the developer and stare at the same screen, or we can jump on a Hangout and share screens. And the developer can say, is this the easing you're looking for? A little faster. Is this the easing you're looking for? Let's go a little bit slower. Is this the easing you're looking for? And because you're sitting next to each other and having a fast conversation, it happens much more smoothly than if you're sending an email with a proof, and then you're sending feedback back, and then you're sending an email with a proof. And so just getting together, again, face-to-face, can knock that out much more quickly. So now that everything is magical rainbows and unicorns, your projects are going to move perfectly, right? sometimes the unicorn eats the rainbow. We know that these instances are very unique to Big Nerd Ranch, but hopefully they're universal enough for you guys to take into your own situations.
So we'd love to open up the floor for discussion. If you have any questions, if you have any war stories you want to share, or if you have recommendations for things that you've tried in your situation that you think other people would find useful, please speak up.
This partnership that you have between developers and designers, was this something that you originally started with, or was it introduced later on?
The question was, is the partnership between developers and designers something that we started with? And the answer is no. Big Nerd Ranch is about 13 years old, and it was started by a developer. It's run by developers. I started at Big Nerd Ranch 2 years ago, October 16th. There were 2 designers there that handed over app icons and some skins sometimes. It was not a very robust department. But in 2 years, we've built ourselves up to 10 people. And we have really intentionally fostered the relationship between designers and developers as we grew. And so we took efforts to educate our clients on what design is, our developers on what design is for Big Nerd Ranch. So it's really a huge umbrella. We're doing wireframes, user research, information architecture, in addition to the visual stuff that developers expected. And so it was a very intentional process where we added education on top of practice. So that's been over the last 2 years that it's really built up. Before that, it was a third-party relationship. Big Nerd Ranch got most of their designs from other agencies.
And we're still evolving.
Oh yeah, this is like, I mean, we're the chubby unicorn eating the rainbow. I mean, we're definitely still experimenting. We love to figure out new ways of doing things, and sometimes it doesn't work, so you have to pivot and you have to, make it work. You had your hand up next?
So what do you do when your designer's in Singapore and you're the developer in Atlanta, or you're the designer in Atlanta and your developer's in Hyderabad?
What do you do when your partner is overseas on a completely different timeline? You stay up really late, and no, seriously, you stay up really late and get on a video chat. Don't do it every day because you're going to ruin, your dog's pee schedule or whatever. But you need to make it a point to sync up on a more human level at some point. And sometimes there's a language barrier with overseas communication. But I think for the most part, it's not too bad. But I think syncing up at least on that level once in a while is important. But additionally, because you're on different time zones, you're going to want to create touch points at the beginning of your day and at the end of your day, because they're basically sleeping while you're working. And so by agreeing on, even if it's a chat stand-up, to talk at the beginning of a day, or even if you have a format such as list for me your roadblocks and your dependencies when you sign off tonight. Then you can see that first thing in your day. You can take care of their roadblocks and dependencies, and you can leave a note for them that says, I took care of these things, here are some new things for you.
It's almost like you could do like a day, it's like a day-to-day sprint, right? Like the designer could be one sprint ahead within a 12-hour.
Theoretically, that's exactly what everybody wants.
I'm curious though, so it sounds like, is this a situation you're in frequently? And
sure.
What, do you have any things that work for you that you want to share?
Stay up late.
Yeah.
Because people in India won't get up in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And for one, they often can only work from an office.
Exactly.
They take a train, so like at their 5 o'clock, they're gone. They will not communicate, be there in any way until their next morning.
I could learn something from it.
It's tough, but yeah.
It is. There have been QA sessions with China that took place at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you get friends with you and you drink a lot of coffee and you power through, but it doesn't happen all the time. You have to find something that's sustainable for you both, and often we can be more flexible on this end. There was a hand over here. We don't do a lot of QA inside Big Nerd Ranch in the traditional check it on 7 browsers sense. We do our own code review internally, and we QA with the client and with the design team. It's up to the client to do really intensive QA. For instance, if they send it to a company that's overseas that does this day in and day out and turns around a lot of feedback that you really don't need. It's really on the client for that. But That one's a little more tough just because in my experience, large QA firms have a formula, a system, and they don't really move away from that. They literally they go through their list, their checklist, and then they hand you a package. Is that the kind of QA you're talking about, or were you talking about something more small scale? Okay.
It's almost the same thing. Developers run the code, you hand it over to QA, that goes there, and they come back with those conditions fixed.
Yeah, in that instance, I would probably put QA one iteration behind. And by iteration, it doesn't mean it's a week. It could mean that it's 2 weeks or 4 weeks or something like that. But if QA is one iteration behind, they know they're going to be receiving a chunk, and they can process that chunk and then hand it back. And that way, the amount of information or the amount of code being reviewed is smaller, so they can turn it around faster. But then also, you're getting through your whole process faster. Let's see, what else was I going to say?
And that is what on the projects I've been on in the past year and a half, that's what we've done. The client has their own QA team, and we encourage them to look at builds. Oftentimes we're getting close to the end on a weekly basis, but there's some small time frame where we're saying, please look at the build, here's the user stories that this build is supposed to address. And then sometimes they have their own acceptance criteria they've shared. Sometimes they're kind of making it up as they go. It just depends. But for us, we try from a development perspective to drive that part through the user stories.
Green shirt?
How have the conversations with the client changed from having designs prepared in advance of a project to the sprint schedules? And then also, where do you put the client review of the design in a one-off sprint schedule?
One of my favorite metaphors is the house metaphor. We're building a house. The first steps are to build a foundation and the wireframe, so the actual door or the wooden frame of the house. Houses go through ugly teenager stages where nothing quite looks right. Fixtures aren't in yet, those kinds of things. And so your app is going to be an ugly teenager for a while until designs start to trickle in. Because a lot of clients, especially in advertising, are used to really perfect visuals to look at. And we have a conversation early on with clients. We let them know you're going to have an ugly teenager. But what you're going to be looking for is functionality. Our clients are actually in Pivotal Tracker with us. It's their job to approve stories. And so sometimes we have to educate the client on Pivotal Tracker, the tool, what user stories are, what their role is in QAing their own stories, and then, of course, that their house is going to look like a teenager, an ugly teenager. Not every teenager's like, anyways. But that's the conversation that we have. We have that educational conversation with them. And for the most part, once they understand what to expect, then they're pretty good with it. But it's just constant communication. Red shirt?
When dealing with billable hours and time like that, if you want to start a process like this, especially coming up with a style guide and things like that, where do you find time to do this? Is it like covert ops or after hours, or do you get buy-in from the company first to convince to pay you for not doing client work?
I disagree that it's not client work, because what you're doing, and the question was, how do I convince the company to allow time for building lifestyle guides and QA while I'm on an hourly rate? And this is really just a best practice for future self, right? You're building the documentation and the foundation so that anyone can pick this up in the future. Because if you don't do those things like a living style guide, you're going to create hours of work in the future. And so that is the justification that I offer. As a freelancer, I would say this is the package. This is how it works. I don't move from this. I deliver good quality work, and this is my base charge. Yeah. And so that's the mentality that I would approach. Do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's great. That's perfect.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. I couldn't get the Wi-Fi in here to work. Does anybody have a... Okay. I'm going to try... Yeah.
Any other questions while we wait for Brandy to
Figure stuff out.
A question around the idea of the aggressive timeline. I'm sure we've all dealt with it, where it's an unrealistic timeline
so hard.
That's it. So how do you deal with a client that wants to get rid of the agile process and go back to waterfall? Okay, or like an account team?
Yeah.
Okay. My experience, I'm going off my cell phone. We'll see if this works. Unless you want to fill in the network information, because that's not happy.
Okay. I'll figure it out.
So I have hot corners. So the whole agile waterfall thing is interesting. There's this sort of concept of like agile-ish, and while it's not great on big projects because things can fall apart real fast, there is a good happy medium place where clients that are uncomfortable or account teams that are uncomfortable with agile because it's an ugly teenager, you can kind of work in mini waterfall sessions. So set expectations. It's just a hot corner. You can just touch something. So this one and this one you should avoid.
Okay. I'll just let you do it. That's
okay.
distracting. I'm sorry.
Do what?
You gotta log into that screen.
Yeah.
Thank you. What's the pass? Is it both?
Good thing we didn't have any live demos other than this. Trouble.
The internet. Okay.
Yay.
That looks successful. All right. Now let's just mirror it. This will be much easier.
I have all that hot corner stuff turned off because whenever I'm teaching, it always bites me. So
That's not actually what it looks like. So that's what it looks like if the CSS is loading. It's kind of boring. It looks really similar to our website. But let me finish this question first. So waterfall-ish. What I have found is that to make clients comfortable with the iterative process, because it's inevitable. Something's going to change, something big, and you're going to have to throw away a lot of hours of work if you do everything at once from a design perspective. So you're either going to have a pissed off designer or you're going to have a pissed off client. So waterfall-ish. I like for the teams to build huge chunks. So if there's like a few key frames or a few key screens, like there's going to be a login screen, there's going to be a home screen, and there's going to be a cart. I will kind of tag those as priority, and I'll discuss with the client. You're going to see these screens first, because the client knows this is what's priority for them. And then we will do like a main design for those. We'll do wireframes and a user flow for those, and that way we're doing a part of the site that we know is probably going to stay pretty consistent. And we're able to have that conversation with the client, get them comfortable with a visual direction, a style direction, and that takes a little more time on the design front, but then the client is more comfortable with a smaller piece of the pie, and I'm not going to introduce another metaphor here, then we ease them into that iterative conversation. And sometimes they like it because they can actually change their mind partway through, and they haven't paid for all of that other work that isn't going to be used. So that's what I have found to be comfortable for clients that really didn't get the agile iterative thing. Does that make sense?
Are you talking about like people who don't accept it from the beginning, or people who like accept it and then they realize, let me like push 17,000 more things into...
That was part of it. I was just wondering the idea of the aggressive timeline where it's just completely unrealistic, and they feel that more the agile process is going to take longer. Mm-hmm. At the end, the future is going to be much brighter. This is like if we get it done.
Yeah.
From a waterfall perspective, it gets done, but then it's dealing with all this crap.
Right. So that's technical debt that you're building. The thing that I discuss with clients when they have a mentality of like setting a deadline makes it get done, is I just say, all right, we set this date, it's a goal, but it's possible we won't meet this. You're just very transparent. And I have found that by them seeing the stories in Pivotal Tracker, they can see how much is done and how much they had in there. If it's an aggressive timeline that you know isn't going to happen, say it. This isn't going to happen. You're going to need to remove at least 3 large features. You just have to have this very direct conversation with them. I have found that clients listen to developers more than designers when you say this can't happen in this amount of time. But by having really blunt conversations with our clients, they've come to respect that we know what we're doing and that we can call a timeline like that. So that's what we do.
I think the other thing too that's helped me, because I've been in this situation recently in the past year, is like offering as much information as you can. So if it can't get done, what are the alternatives? So when could it get done? What could you do instead? Like, what is going to happen if we don't do it? Like, how can we, make this all still be a shippable product?
Yeah.
But it's hard. But that speak up thing when we're talking about with your collaborators, the same as for the client, and it is not an easy conversation. And they're going to be mad at first, but it's so much better to just like get through it the first time, or even the first few times, and then they just start to realize like you have their best interests in mind. Like,
and
want it to be a success.
If you put in writing, this deadline may not happen based on decisions that are made throughout the process. If it's in writing somewhere in the contract or in an email or something, then when that date comes and it's not finished, you can bring the client back and remind them, remember we had this conversation and here we are. Now what are we going to do to move forward and get this done? I like to reiterate that kind of stuff over and over again because it's a really effective CYA. It's reminding the client that this is the real world. I'm coding something that I haven't coded before. I don't exactly know how long this is going to take. By the way, that was the biggest revelation for me. I've been a designer for 15 years, and I never once thought that a developer was automatically saying no because they have to figure the damn thing out. Like, I didn't ever think about that. And so, I mean, there's something to learn for everyone, but Living Style Guide. So like I said, this is going to look rather boring because it looks a lot like the website. You can see as we pan down, we get more and more specific. So these are more and more custom executions, and they happened later on. But you can see here, this is our primary button color, our secondary button color. You can just get the code right here. You can grab it. So everything's in line. It's on the site, is in the container that it's going to end up in, and everything becomes really consistent. This way, if the designer introduces something new, the developer can say, hey, so this is really similar to this module that we designed. Is there any way that we could also use this module here? Or is there a reason that we need to have this more custom solution? And it's worked out really well for us. Yep.
Documentation, you were talking about in the beginning you split your ticketing system with devs and designers. Do you think it's a good idea to have all your documentation for like developers, nitty-gritty, all the way up through design to business rules and everything in one, or should we split up, and how do you handle that, as well as documenting animation and all that?
Yeah, we also use a tool called Basecamp. And that is where we keep a lot of the high-level documentation and a lot of the style documentation at the end of a project. Developers often keep documentation contextual, so it's in the Git repo or something like that, so the developer that picks it up later can grab it from there. But documentation on styling, if it's in here, then it's actually living with the project. If it is an animation that is from, say, a prototyping tool, then we'll put like a README or something like that into Basecamp that has, or even a link in Basecamp that has the prototype that you can reference later. Basecamp, we've found, is a great place for clients to collaborate, for developers and designers to collaborate. You can assign tasks, you can store documents. We found it pretty effective to be like a little central hub for that stuff. Additionally, we use Dropbox for our design files. We found that it's very efficient for groups to use Dropbox. We can share links with clients very easily, but keep them from editing our files if we need to. And then if we have our, we have our PSDs or Illustrator or Sketch files, whatever we're using for that project, or even if we get into the code, it's going to be in Git. But that kind of stuff can live there in Dropbox. And if we slice files, we'll do it in Dropbox and hand it to the developer there. Sometimes we'll upload it straight to the repo, but that's kind of our process.
One thing too that that we have done in the projects I've been on with documentation is there are so many different pieces of documentation, and they do sometimes end up all over the place. is for each user story or maybe each epic, you start to add links to files wherever they may be on Dropbox or some web server somewhere. So you try to give like contextual information for each story. Like if there's a particular API call as a developer that the person making this or implementing the story is going to have to use, you can link that there. You might link the design doc, etc. So like that chunk of work has all the information it needs.
Any other questions?
Couple comments. One is, I kind of like to not show the client like a design too quickly. If you can get by with using something like Balsamic or even that Marble to get the basic sort of bits and pieces in front of them so they can start feeling like they're touching them and not get so distracted on what color blue,
Yes.
then that helps the whole process.
Yeah, for those that couldn't hear, often when sharing designs with a client, you don't want to show an ugly teenager too quickly. And so using a tool like Balsamic or Marvel or something like that, you can show, at WebMD, they would take it so literally. And our client was the executive management. And so we would make the wireframes super sketchy looking. It looked like someone drew them. Now, one time I did that, and the woman that I shared it with was like, "This is amazing, we're running with this." And so we ended up with these little wireframe drawings of children on WebMD. They're on the parenting channel, you can see them now. But anyways, it was very successful for us to just like basically kind of dumb down the design until they could focus on the functionality. Thanks for that tip.
Yeah, the other thing is invite your developers to the client.
Oh, the kickoff is the developer, the client, and the designer, and then our project strategist.
We
definitely.
should say that. Thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you.
That's a big, because
Yeah.
you can hear their excitement, their vision.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of information that gets lost in translation. At Big Nerd Ranch, the developers are actually working with the clients directly. They are the main contact with clients.
Did you have something?
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-up in the same lines. I was wondering how you manage the expectations of possible changes. Because if you do design stories first, that tends to dictate a lot of functionality and experience. So if the developers don't participate, when it gets to the developer story and effort point, things may change. So how do you manage the possible back and forth?
Sometimes there's frustration at those changes, and sometimes they're inevitable. We're in the middle of a project right now where, because of iterative design, we figured out that what we thought was going to happen on a main key screen wasn't right, and so we had to change it. And so the developers got really frustrated because they had to go in and change stuff that they had already built. But by building in modules and styles that you can control universally, you can mitigate some of that headache. But it's about having a conversation. It's like about saying, I know it sucks, but we have to do it. This is best for the user, or this is what the client wants, or it's not going to work that other way. So it's just about like meeting frequently, and again, like reiterating that human side can really help with those conversations too. If the developer or the designer knows that you're not trying to ruin their day, you're
Making my life terrible.
you actually have other things that you're worried about, then that really goes a long way. Thanks so much, guys.
Yeah, thank you.